everybody. I am Ryan, one of the founders of Bustld, and I am here with my wife, Samie, co-founder of Bustld, as well as owner of Something Perfect Weddings. And Samie is not only is she a co-owner and an amazing mom, she is a wedding planner here in our hometown of Charlotte. So today, with our very first recording, our very first podcast, we are going to touch on the subject that is most dear to everyone who just got engaged. Where do you start? So there's a few things we're going to talk about today. But before we even kind of dive into some of those key things that you're going to start with, the first thing that anyone's ever going to do is they're going to go to Instagram and they're going to Instagram that ring. Yeah. What are some things that they should be thinking about? That the couple should be thinking about as they as soon as they say yes. What should they be thinking about from a social media perspective?
So before you even hit Instagram, I think you want to make sure that you let your VIPs know. As great as it is to kind of shout it out there on social media, you want to tell grandma and your best friend and definitely your parents, of course. Let them know. Of course. Let them know first before you even put it on social media.
I think ours would have been upset.
I think so, a little bit. Yeah. But and make sure you kind of tell everyone too, like if say, hey, if you don't mind waiting to put it on social media or share pictures if they're involved until after I have a chance to tell all those kind of people that are closest to my heart before you kind of put it out there. And once you do, then make sure you take a great picture of that ring. Maybe think about getting a manicure if you haven't already, and post that out there on social media because it is fun to share that news.
Awesome. That's great advice and perfect. So with that, I guess I should have started with this, but congratulations on getting engaged. Today we are going to be talking about the three biggest things that you should be focused on when you're first getting started planning your wedding. Those three things that we hear from our couples all the time are budget, guest list, and style. So Samie, we're excited to kind of dive into this a little bit. So
it's a great subject.
So the biggest one that we hear all the time is the nasty B word, budget.
Yeah.
So why is it so important to decide on your budget, especially in the beginning?
So budget determines everything. It determines if you're having your wedding at the nicest place in town, or maybe you have to go a little bit outside of town to fit in budget. So, you definitely want to have that conversation. It's not fun, but you want to have an idea of where your budget lies. So have that conversation with anyone who you think is going to be contributing to the wedding. If that's the two of you guys, make sure you guys have a conversation about that. Maybe you talk about setting up a bank account and setting aside some money every month.
That's a good idea.
Make sure you talk to, both sets of parents. What are they hoping to contribute? Are they contributing a lump sum? Or are they going to kind of approve things as you come to them with requests? Are they buying the dress and the venue but leaving the bar and the food up to you? So have those conversations and have a good idea of where that money is coming from, and then you can sit down and start looking at venue and style and most importantly guest list, because your guest list is going to be the biggest contributor to your budget. So you want to have a really good idea of what that looks and feels like before you start getting too far into planning.
No, that's fair. That's fair. So, okay, we've had that conversation. We've talked to the parents. We've talked to each other on what we're all willing to contribute. Now, with the budget as far as it's concerned, where do you start?
It can be very overwhelming. So shameless plug, planner's a great way to start. They can help you understand what the averages are in your local market, how to divvy up your money, where to put the money in the things that are most important for you. But if that's not 100% sure you're going to go that route, then a great place to start is looking at what is important to you. So sit down and list out everything that's going to go into your budget. So wedding budgets are this weird thing. Like I kind of mentioned, some people might be contributing and want to pay for, dress and venue and bar, but maybe they're not paying for the rings or the honeymoon or whatever it is. So decide what goes into that main budget of where most of the money is coming from, and then prioritize. So is food and beverage and, band or DJ your number one priorities, or is the look your number one priority? And so kind of set those expectations with yourself, and then do a little bit of research, find out what are kind of the averages. Ask your friends, ask your any vendors that you have booked, and just kind of get an idea of how that money is going to spend and where it's going to go.
Okay. So that you bring up an interesting question, though. So there's a million kind of resources out there, even like a Bustld, right? There's a million things out there, and they all seem to say a different thing. How do you know what's true, what's not true, what's sort of true? How do you know if the data is skewed? I mean, how do you, as an engaged couple, how do you kind of sift through all that information and kind of decide what is realistic for the different categories?
Yeah, I mean, again, a planner is a great resource for that. But if you're, looking at a site like a Bustld, you can find out a lot of great information as far as kind of reaching out to maybe a few of your vendors that are your top picks and getting like initial pricing information. I always encourage you to kind of have that conversation with the vendors, let them know, okay, I'm not sure if this is going to fit in my budget. I may not be in touch for a couple of weeks. Don't leave them hanging. But definitely kind of gather your information, talk to your engaged or married friends, keeping in mind, if they got married a couple of years ago or in a different market, that is not going to necessarily be comparable apples to apples, but it is always a good idea to kind of get that insight and get that kind of validation from your friends.
Sure.
And then I think also like the first thing you're going to book is obviously your venue. So you're going to look at those and kind of compare apples to apples. I encourage couples to say, okay, this venue offers chairs and linens and food and beverage. This space is a blank space, so I'm gonna have to bring in all those things, and then you can start kind of comparing what those costs would look like. So get initial quotes, do your research on the front end, and then you'll make sure that you're spending your money in the right way.
I think that's great advice, because whether it's you planning a wedding or anything really, you should make sure you can compare apples to apples and understand kind of what things cost when you don't know.
Yeah.
So I think that's great advice. And then another kind of thing that always comes to mind too is really, prioritizing what matters to you. So even averages in and of themselves are somewhat kind of irrelevant, right? Because it's really what it matters to you as an individual and as a couple.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we talk to couples who their number one priority is their venue, or their number one priority is having, the most amazing flowers or the best band. So even if the average is, for that category is $3,000, if it's your number one category and it's the most important to you, then maybe you're going to spend a little more than the average. Maybe you're going to spend $4,000 or $5,000 there, and then maybe some things that are less of a priority to you, you're going to spend a little under average.
Sure.
So I think making sure that you keep that in mind and that you spend the money in the right places, and then continually, the budget's not a set in stone number. So if your most important thing is your photographer and you overspend in that category, and then you go back to that list that you guys made in the beginning and say, okay, invitations were a little less important to us. Maybe, we can cut and not do something custom. Maybe we go to an online website and save a little bit of money there to make up for the money that we overspent. So continue to work on that budget and think of it as an ongoing conversation and ongoing topic, and make sure that you are checking in on your budget on occasion.
No, that's yeah, absolutely.
It's not a one-time kind of thing, because then you'll get to the end and you'll have overspent, and then it causes frustration and uncomfortable conversations of more money. And that's another thing to think about too. Is your budget set in stone? Do you have X number of dollars and that is it? In that case, definitely maybe underestimate, build yourself a little bit of a buffer so that you aren't spending the money and then coming up at the end and still needing, 3 big categories of things and not having any money left.
Right.
So
especially when you get to the categories towards the end that tend to book later, you're going to want to get a cake from a professional baker.
Oh yeah, 100%.
You're not going to want a friend to make that. You're going to want that beautiful tiered cake that you've always dreamt of, but because you spent too much in the beginning, you weren't keeping track, you've sort of kind of lost track of it. So right. I think that's great advice. And I think the big kind of takeaway there is to make sure that you do make that list. Make sure that you have got in a priority list and you can kind of go back to it, because the wedding planning process for us was emotional, and for our couples and Sammy's couples as a planner, it's an emotional one. So you want to make sure that you kind of set yourself up for success and have those things ranked as you go, and you can start to kind of negotiate with yourselves on where and how to spend the money. I think that was your main.
Yeah, and I mean also if something is super important to you guys and you guys have a little extra money that maybe you can pull from later, increase that budget a little bit and still feel comfortable with it. But of course, you want to have that conversation. Money's not a fun thing to talk about, and it certainly doesn't want to go into a marriage feeling frustrated with money before you even get married.
Absolutely agree. So, speaking of, what are some common mistakes couples make when budgeting?
I mean, I think we touched on it a little bit, but definitely like getting really excited and booking something without talking about budget. So especially, I mean, obviously the venue, and a lot of those include catering and bar. So kind of going in and spending money that you haven't sat down and kind of figured out how much money you have, and then having a very small amount left to spend on all the other things you need to make that wedding day possible. So I think that's the biggest mistake people make, is they get really excited and they book something and then they realize they don't have enough money for everything else. And then I think the other biggest mistake is not thinking about the little things. So little things add up. Gratuities at the end of planning.
Always tip your vendors.
So things like that really, really add up. Small things like the marriage license and postage and
sure, postage is expensive when you add it up times 125 guests for
and you need 2 per invitation at least, and you have your save the dates. So little things like that, if you want calligraphy, that's like such a nice touch. So a lot of those things are little things that get cut at the end, like you were talking about, because you kind of spent that money on the front end. So make sure that you're budgeting for all the things that go into the budget, so you're not feeling frustrated at the end that you can't have what you want.
Perfect. And then lastly, what sort of tools, besides Bustld, of course, what sort of tools could couples use to help them with the budget process? What sorts of things do your couples use as something perfect and just you've kind of seen out there that are helpful?
I mean, a budget can be everything as simple as an Excel document to, online trackers. Obviously, depending on how you think about budget. But I think the best thing to do with it is to have something that's shared between everyone who's contributing to the budget. So, a Google Drive is a great way to kind of share that Excel document.
That's super common.
Right, exactly. And everyone can have access to it. You guys can have those ongoing conversations. You can look at where the budget numbers are, and it's not kind of just like a document that's living on your desktop that you never look at again.
Sure. And the idea of sharing it, I think, is important, because then everyone kind of has access and the people feel involved and they can kind of see where things are going. So, 100%. And the accountability too, right?
Yeah. I think that's the biggest thing too. I mean, maybe you guys plan to sit down once a month and look at budget numbers. And
sounds exciting.
Sounds really exciting. Pop open a bottle of wine and make it a little more fun.
Does that come out of the budget?
No, that's separate.
Okay.
But maybe, just keep in mind that you do need to touch base on that budget. After you book a vendor, I think that's the biggest thing. After you book a vendor, add it to your budget and then look at where you are. Do you need to adjust those numbers? Do you have a little extra money that maybe you can put towards something that you weren't sure if you were going to invest in? So kind of just making sure that you look at it on a regular occasion.
Sure. Okay. Perfect. Well, thank you so much on the budget side. That was super helpful, and I know that's one of the biggest concerns when you're first starting out.
Yeah.
And I think it's so important because, again, it just sets you up for success later.
It does.
Your engagements are they take some time. It's not a sprint.
Right. And I think, it's obviously a huge investment no matter what your budget is. And it's probably one of the biggest parties you've ever thrown, most likely. And so, keeping in mind that it is not something that you have to book everything right away. Take your time, do your research, and make sure that you're sticking true to your budget and your priorities as a couple.
I think that's great. So thank you again for that. And the next kind of big thing to think about, and I don't know if everyone knows you should think about this in the very beginning, but is guest list.
Yeah.
You mentioned it before in budget that it really does have a big impact on the overall cost of your wedding and those sorts of things. So as far as your guest list, how do you start building that out?
Yeah, so I think that once you've had that budget conversation, then you can start thinking about guest lists. So what I kind of said before is that your guest list is the biggest contributor to your budget. So a wedding, a $50,000 wedding for 100 people versus a $50,000 wedding for 300 people is a very different style and a very different budget.
Sure.
Because your guest count is contributing to your cost at the venue, your cost at food and beverage, your cost for rentals, invitations, so many items that are priced per person.
Right.
So you want to make sure that you have a realistic number of guests that enters into that budget. So you want to look at the two together.
Sure.
So if you need to shave some money off the budget, cut that guest list down. Cutting 10, 15, 25 people off that guest list can save you a lot of money.
But I wanted to invite my friend I haven't seen since elementary school.
Right. Well, they may not make the list. So I think when you're putting together the guest list, you want to think about, kind of priorities. So I think about dividing your guest list in thirds. One for each couple's, families, and if you have, divorce situations, cut, their third in half, so that everyone has kind of an equal contributor to that overall guest list, and then the couple together also should have a third of that guest list. So think about it in that way, and then ask everyone to prioritize. Obviously your aunts and uncles and grandparents are going to be number one priority, your best friends, but maybe that friend since middle school that you haven't talked to in a while, maybe they're priority too, so they might not be on the list if you can't have a 300-person wedding.
Sure.
So kind of look at it that way as well and start prioritizing your friends and family.
So you kind of jumped ahead on me a little bit, but so handling if one family wants to invite more than the other, how do you navigate that? This is actually probably more of a psychology question than it is a guest list question, but how do you handle when one half of the equation wants to invite significantly more than the other?
So it can definitely be difficult. You certainly don't want to start off wedding planning, making either side of the family uncomfortable and unhappy. So it's definitely a balancing act. So I think kind of setting expectations up front, like, hey, you have 100 invitations. And you can say, hey, this is what fits in our budget, or we're looking at these types of venues and this is our max guest list. So kind of think about it in those terms and set expectations with them. I think it's a little different too if family is contributing money and they want to invite their friends and family, then of course you can kind of have that conversation. Look, if we increase the guest list to accommodate your extra 25 invitations, that's going to cost us X number of more dollars. So are you willing to contribite that money to cover that cost? That's a good thing.
I've got a budget already built out in a spreadsheet.
Exactly. So, keeping in mind that and talking about that, and also just having those conversations with them and being frank, like, look, we don't want it to be really one-sided. We really want this to be a combination of two families and friends coming together. So let's not, kind of make another side of the family unhappy.
Sure. No, absolutely. That's great advice. And then, another one that we've been asked before too is so you're on a budget. Yep. Everybody's on a budget.
Doesn't matter what the budget is. Everyone's on a budget.
Hypothetically, if you were invited to someone else's wedding, do you have to reciprocate the invitation?
No, you definitely don't have to. It gets a little trickier, of course, because you're going to feel a little bit of that guilt. But, I kind of like to think about it. Have you talked to them in the past year? What about in the future? Do you see yourself talking to them in the next year? Do you see yourself talking to them in 5 years? What about 10 years? Like 10 years down the road, are you still going to be friends with this person? If the answer is no, then they're probably not the best person to be there. At the end of the day, yes, you want to be nice and, reciprocate those feelings, but you got to think about the purpose of this event. The purpose is to celebrate the two of you. I've had couples who've had the rule, if they haven't met both of us, they're not invited. So, just think about those rules. And I think that's another thing when it comes to guest lists. Set some rules. So, if I haven't talked to them in the past year, they're not invited. Or if it's a work person, then they're not invited. Or, if they're under the age of 15, they're not invited. Or if they're, 3 family members removed, they're not invited. Set those rules and explain that to both sets of parents and make sure that it's across the board the same rules. So if anyone ever got their feelings hurt, you could say, look, we were having a smaller wedding. We kind of had to stop at second cousins removed or whatever kind of extension of the family it is.
No, I think that's great. And to kind of dig a little deeper, you mentioned work peeps.
Yeah.
How do you feel about inviting work colleagues?
I think it depends. It depends on your work situation. If you work at a small company and you're inviting 5 of the 8 people, that's uncomfortable. You kind of need to invite all 8 of them. If you work at a big corporation and you're inviting, just your team, sure, that's great. So I think kind of it goes back to that same thing, set the rules, make sure that, if you hang out with them outside of work, then yeah, they're probably your friends and it makes sense to invite them. If you guys just hang out at work, probably don't have to invite them in that. I think it's very easy to explain, you know what, we're just not inviting work people because we didn't want to make it uncomfortable.
Sure. No, that makes perfect sense. I have 2 words for you.
Yes.
Plus ones.
That is literally what I was just thinking. So that can be a totally whole other, kind of beast of the guest list. So general rule is if they're married, they should definitely get that +1.
Sure.
If they are in a serious relationship, so they're engaged, they live together, they've been together for 5 years, it really is appropriate to invite their +1. If you have someone who's single and doesn't have necessarily a +1, but they know they're part of your huge group of friends, so maybe all of your sorority sisters or all your work people, then in that case, you don't necessarily have to give them a +1. But if it's a friend who maybe doesn't know a lot of people, or friends who are traveling from afar, who maybe wouldn't come because they would feel uncomfortable without a +1,
sure,
then I think it's a super nice thing to kind of extend that +1 if your budget can allow. So
yeah, it goes back to budget.
It does go back to budget. I mean, you got to think about, would you rather have your friend there with their +1 who you may not know, or
that second cousin
that
got
second
cut.
cousin.
Right.
Yeah,
no, it makes sense. No, that's I know that's kind of a tricky thing too.
Yeah.
And now I'm just curious, what would you do if somebody just brought a +1 anyway, or wrote in on an RSVP that they're +2 or +1?
Both things can happen. If someone writes in a +1, it's kind of a question of, how uncomfortable do you want to be?
Right. Right.
So, if you really have a tight space or a tight budget and you just don't have the space to allow for that +1, call them, let them know, hey, look, I'm really sorry, but we're on a tight budget, or we just don't have any more space in the venue and we only have 1 chair reserved for you. You can definitely indicate that on the invitation as well to kind of help avoid some of those awkward conversations.
Sure.
Sometimes people just kind of let it go. If someone shows up with a +1, usually your coordinator is going to just kind of make it happen. So that's one of those.
At least have a coordinator.
Yes, at least have a coordinator because they will just make that happen. They'll get them a chair. They'll make sure they have food. Is it ideal? No, but it does happen.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you again for sharing on guest lists. I know it's an important topic that does need to be talked about in the beginning because it really does affect the budget.
It does, and if you're not sure, make yourself an A-list and a B-list. Make those A-list people, they all get saved to dates. Work people could be on that B-list. If you have extra space or you get an indication that a lot of people aren't going to be able to make it, then maybe you send those invitations to the B-list people later on.
Perfect. Well, next big subject, when it comes to just getting started, is your style.
Yeah.
So how do you begin to determine in your style and then also incorporate your future spouse's style into how you build out your wedding?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the first place to start is kind of season. So do you have a style in mind? Do you love spring flowers? Do you love the look of Christmas? What kind of season do you like? So that can help to determine, kind of that first initial look and help you to narrow down those dates, which is obviously going to be something that you have to start thinking about before you go look at venues. And then also look around, look at the clothes that you wear. Where do you shop? What kind of style do you have at home? So look at all of those things and kind of start to realize, what do you guys have in common? What colors do you both love? And have that conversation. Maybe your future spouse cares, maybe your future spouse doesn't care, but talk about it. Are you guys a mix of modern and rustic? Okay, how can we kind of find in between? Because a lot of times that does happen. People have 2 very different styles.
Right.
So maybe you go with a more modern venue, but you bring in some rustic elements of, trees or greenery or something like that to kind of share both of you guys in that space.
Sure.
I think looking at Pinterest or Bustld's Wedspiration boards, that can be a great way to start pulling photos and really look at those photos. What is actually in common between the 2 of them? Did you pull pictures of all peonies, even though they're all different styles. Peonies are maybe your favorite flower, you didn't even know it. Or
I love them. I do.
You didn't even know, right?
No, I had no idea.
So, just look at those things that are kind of in common, and then you can start to kind of determine what your style is.
Okay, cool. And then to kind of go a little deeper there, so what are some ways to incorporate your style besides peonies?
So I think the first place you're going to incorporate it is your venue, right? So you're going to want to make sure that the venue sets the tone for everything else. And then you start looking into flowers and invitations, cake, all of that can incorporate style and the kind of feel that you're wanting to create. Lighting is something that a lot of people overlook, but can completely change a space. Everything from up lights to market lights to gobo projectors on the wall. It can really, really transform a space and give it a totally different feel. So that's something a lot of people don't think about. Incorporating your style. Sorry, lost my train of thought. But anyways,
you were just thinking about market lights.
I was.
She's been trying to get me to get market lights in the backyard for a while, so that's what she's thinking about.
I was. But also think about those personal items too. So little things like favors or welcome bags, menu cards, monograms, fun things like that you can really customize the space and make it feel really personal. So when people leave their wedding, they're thinking about, oh, that was so them, as opposed to oh, that was a nice wedding,
Yeah, no, that's great. So that's, we really appreciate that. So I guess, again, just to get started, after you've talked to all your VIPs.
That's right.
Post it on Insta.
Yeah.
And other social media.
Of course.
whatever
Snapchat,
social right.
all the things.
Right. Then we're going to focus on the budget.
Yes.
Then we're going to focus on the guest list, and then we're going to define our style as a couple.
Yeah, and I think all three of those things will be happening kind of at the same time, and you want to make sure you think about all that stuff before you even start planning, before you even start touching on the fact of looking at venues. Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Samie. Yeah. Thank you guys for joining us today. We will we'll look to continue this podcast and these recordings and hitting some subjects that are important to you guys. So if you have anything that you want us to discuss and get it plugged into the podcast, you can reach out to us on the chat button in the bottom of the corner of the site. You can always email us at support@bustld, bustld.com. We look forward to seeing those emails, and we look forward to seeing you guys again. Thank you again, Samie. Thanks.